Winter, 1887, arrived without warning, as if the sky itself had decided the waiting was over. The first hard frost came in the night. By morning the settlement lay silent under a skin of white, smoke rising straight up from chimneys into a pale, metallic sky. The prairie grass had stiffened into brittle wire. The creek at the edge of the valley wore a fragile crust of ice that snapped like glass when stepped upon. Every man in the settlement knew what this meant. There were only weeks, perhaps days, before the real cold came down from the north and settled in like an uninvited relative. Most families had spent autumn preparing in the usual ways. Woodpiles stood stacked shoulder-high beside cabins. Cracks between logs had been sealed with mud and straw. Windows were stuffed with rags. Doors had been thickened with extra planks nailed crudely across the interior. Everyone followed the same pattern because everyone feared the same thing: the wind. The wind did not simply blow here. It attacked. It came low and fast over the open land, gathering nothing to slow it, nothing to weaken it, until it struck the cabins like a living thing determined to get inside. Thomas Hale knew this better than most. His cabin stood slightly apart from the others, not out of arrogance, but because when he first arrived the only available claim lay at the edge of the slope, where the land dipped toward the creek. The ground there rose gently behind the structure, a shallow hill that shielded the rear wall from some of the wind. At the time, people said he was lucky. Later, they said he was odd. On a gray morning in late September, long before the first snow, Thomas stepped outside, carrying a shovel and a pickaxe. The air already smelled like winter-thin, sharp, promising discomfort. He stood for a moment, studying the stretch of ground between his front door and the rutted track that passed for a road. It was not a long distance, perhaps 20 feet from the road to the cabin's entrance, a straight, ordinary path, worn flat by boots. He drove the shovel into the earth. At first, no one noticed. Men were busy splitting wood. Women were hauling war. Children were chasing each other in the dust. A single man digging in front of his own cabin did not attract attention, but Thomas did not stop. He worked through the afternoon, carving a narrow trench directly in line with his front door. The soil was dry and stubborn, packed hard from years of sun. He dug steadily, not hurried, not hesitant. When the sun dipped low and the air turned cold enough to sting his knuckles, he leaned the shovel against the cabin wall and went inside. The trench was only a foot deep. The next day, he deepened it. By the third day, the trench reached his knees. That was when the laughter began. It started casually. A passing neighbor paused, resting an axe on his shoulder. "Building yourself a grave out front, Thomas." Thomas did not look up immediately. He set his shovel into the dirt again, lifted a heavy scoop, and tossed it aside. "Not a grave," he said calmly. The neighbor squinted down at the growing channel. "Looks like a trench to me." Thomas nodded once. "That's what it is." "For what?" Thomas did not answer. He dug. Word traveled quickly in a small settlement where novelty was rare and entertainment rarer still. By the end of the week, 2 more men had wandered over under the pretense of stretching their legs. They stood at the edge of the trench, boots crumbling loose dirt back into it. "You planning to run water through there?" "Going to plant potatoes underground." "Maybe he's hiding from his wife," one of them added with a grin. Thomas rested his hands on the shovel handle and looked up at them, not annoyed, not embarrassed. Simply steady. "I am building a covered walk." There was a pause. "A covered walk?" One repeated, "to the front door." Silence lingered just long enough for the idea to settle. Then came the laughter, full, unrestrained. "A tunnel? To your own door? You worried about getting snow on your boots." Thomas did not argue. He did not defend himself. He simply returned to digging. The trench grew deeper, waist deep now. The soil changed color as he cut into layers that had not seen daylight in years. The earth below the surface was colder, damp in places, compacted by time. He struck stones occasionally, prying them loose with the pickaxe. His palms blistered and split. Dirt packed beneath his fingernails. Still he worked. People began adjusting their routines to pass by his cabin more often. Children stood at the edge and tossed pebbles into the trench to hear them clink against the shovel blade. Women whispered from a distance, shaking their heads. Men leaned on fence posts and speculated loudly about how long before the first heavy rain turned it into a muddy pit. "He'll twist an ankle in that thing." "No, we'll fill it in one night." "He is wasting good autumn days. Should be cutting more wood." That part stung, though he did not show it. Firewood was currency here. Security. Warmth meant survival. A man who neglected his woodpile invited disaster. Thomas's woodpile was modest. Not small, but not excessive. He had calculated what he believed he would need. Others had stacked nearly double. They watched him dig and saw a man gambling with winter. What they did not see were the winters behind him. Thomas had not arrived in the territory naive. He had spent 3 seasons further north before abandoning that claim after a drought killed the soil. He remembered doors that rattled all night under wind pressure. He remembered snow driven through keyholes. He remembered waking to frost forming on the inside walls of his cabin, glittering faintly in the glow of dying embers. He remembered the sound of wind knifing under the door, the sharp whistle that seemed harmless until you felt the draft crawl across the floor and wrap around your ankles. Most of all, he remembered how much wood it took to fight that draft. Fire was not only about burning logs. It was about feeding an enemy that never stopped pressing at the edges of your shelter. He had lain awake many nights thinking about it. A cabin could be sealed, but the door remained a weakness. Every time it opened, the wind rushed in, displacing warm air in seconds. Even when closed, it shuddered against its frame. A straight path for open prairie to interior space. That was the flaw. The trench deepened until Thomas stood below ground level. When he looked up, the world appeared framed by earth walls on either side. The road was no longer visible unless he climbed out. He began carving the trench slightly wider, enough for a man carrying firewood to walk through without scraping his shoulders. He measured with the span of his arms, adjusting carefully. One afternoon, as clouds rolled in heavy and low, old Mr. Kessler approached slowly, cane tapping against frozen clods. Kessler had survived more winters than anyone else in the settlement. His beard was thin and white, his eyes pale but sharp. He peered down into the trench. "You intend to roof it?" he asked. Thomas paused. "Yes." "With what?" "Timber beams, planks across. Sod on top." Kessler considered this. He did not laugh. "Wind'll still find its way," he said quietly. "Not if it can, T-blow straight." Thomas replied. The old man studied him a moment longer, then nodded once and walked away without another word. The laughter from others grew louder as the trench reached nearly 5 feet deep. From the road, all one could see was Thomas' head moving below ground like some burrowing creature. "Living like a badger," someone shouted one evening. The name stuck for a time. Children began calling him that when they thought he could, here. Badger Hill. He did not correct them. Instead, he began hauling cut timber from the small stand of trees near the creek. He selected straight trunks, stripped them, trimmed them to length. Each beam was measured against the width of the trench. He lowered the first beam across the gap one crisp morning while frost still coated the grass. It rested firmly on either side, flush against the earthen walls. Another beam followed, then another. The structure began to suggest its purpose. Neighbors gathered again. "You are serious," one said, less amused now and more puzzled. Thomas wiped sweat from his brow despite the cold. "Yes." "You will bury yourself in there." "No." "You planning to crawl through that thing?" "Walk." Thomas corrected calmly. They stared at the partially roofed trench. The beams formed ribs across the gap, like the skeleton of some animal emerging from the soil. He laid planks across the beams, sealing the top. He worked methodically, hammer ringing sharp in the cool air. Each nail was driven carefully. He left no gaps. Then came the sod. He cut thick sections of grass and earth from behind the cabin and laid them atop the wooden roof, roots upward. He packed loose soil between them. When finished, the structure looked like nothing more than a raised strip of ground leading from the road to his door. From a distance, it almost disappeared, but the entrance remained visible, a narrow opening at road level, descending gently into the covered passage. Children crept close to peer inside. "It is dark?" one whispered. Thomas lit a lantern and carried it in. The interior glowed faintly amber. The walls were firm, the ceiling solid. The air inside was already noticeably still compared to the open prairie outside. He stepped back into daylight and regarded his work. The mockery did not cease entirely, but it softened. Curiosity had begun to replace ridicule. Then October hardened into November. The first true snow fell overnight, quiet and steady. It blanketed the settlement, smoothing edges, muffling sound. By morning, most cabin doors were half buried, drifts already forming against windward walls. Thomas' tunnel entrance wore a cap of snow on its sod roof, but the opening itself remained clear. He brushed it lightly with a broom. A man passing by stopped. "One till last," he muttered. Thomas only nodded. The second storm came with wind. It roared across the prairie, driving snow sideways. Cabins creaked. Chimneys moaned. Doors rattled violently on their hinges. Inside Thomas' cabin, he stood near the entrance, listening. The outer tunnel opening howled faintly, but the sound dulled as it curved toward the inner door. The passage did not run perfectly straight. He had angled it slightly during construction, forcing wind to bend before reaching the cabin. He waited. The inner door trembled once, twice, but it did not shudder the way doors had in his previous winters. No thin whistle cut along the floorboards. He opened the inner door briefly and stepped into the tunnel. Cold air pulled low along the passage floor. He could feel it at his boots. But above knee height, the air was calmer, less aggressive. He stepped back inside and closed the inner door. Outside, the wind continued its assault. By morning, drifts climbed hot against many cabin doors. Men had to shoulder them open, shoving snow inward to clear space. Each opening invited a rush of freezing air inside, extinguishing warmth in seconds. Thomas emerged through his tunnel, pushing open the outer entrance against a modest drift that had formed but not packed hard. The snow atop the sawed roof had insulated the structure further. As he walked back from the road carrying a sack of grain, he moved through stillness instead of wind. He did not smile, but he noticed, and so did others. One neighbor, struggling to clear his own doorway for the third time that week, paused and glanced toward Thomas's cabin. The raised strip of earth leading to the entrance stood firm under snow, almost invisible. The laughter, when it came now, sounded forced. "Hope you don't get lost in your rabbit hole," someone called half-heartedly. Thomas only inclined his head and continued about his work. He had not built the tunnel for praise. He had built it for silence, for the quiet that came when wind could no longer speak directly into his home. And as the days shortened and the air sharpened into true winter, that silence began to feel like strength. The settlement watched. They waited. And though none would admit it yet, they wondered whether the man they had mocked as a burrowing fool might have seen something they had missed. The trench was no longer a curiosity. It was a question. And winter had not yet given its final answer. By the time the first hard freeze sealed the creek in a sheet of dull gray ice, Thomas Hale had already made his decision. The tunnel was not an impulse. It was not stubbornness. It was not pride. It was calculation. For 3 winters in 3 different territories, he had fought the same enemy and lost the same battle in small, exhausting ways. Not enough to kill him. Not enough to drive him mad. But enough to understand something others seemed content to ignore. Cold did not defeat a cabin by force alone. It defeated it through repetition. Every time a door opened, heat fled. Every time wind struck wood grain head-on, pressure found weakness. Every time snow drifted against a frame and melted slightly from interior warmth, moisture crept into seams and later froze, widening gaps that had once been tight. A cabin did not fail in a single dramatic moment. It failed inch by inch. Thomas had begun noticing patterns during his first winter further north. His cabin then had faced open land with nothing but a split-rail fence between him and miles of prairie. He remembered the sound the wind made when it hit the door straight on, a low, steady hum that built into a shudder. Not chaotic, not random, direct. He had wedged cloth into the cracks. He had reinforced the hinges. He had nailed extra planks across the inside. None of it stopped the pressure. It only dulled it, and always, when he opened the door to step outside, to gather wood, to check traps, to fetch water, the interior warmth seemed to vanish in an instant, replaced by a slicing draft that crawled along the floor and settled into his bones. He began to time it. One evening, he banked the fire carefully and waited until the room grew steady and warm. He noted the way his breath no longer fogged heavily in the air. Then he opened the door for no more than 5 seconds. The temperature drop was immediate and physical. The warmth did not drift out gently. It rushed. It was not the act of opening the door that cost him the most wood. It was the direction the door faced. He started watching smoke. When wind struck the cabin head-on, smoke from the chimney flattened sideways and pressed low before lifting. When the wind shifted, the smoke rose more cleanly. The difference inside the cabin was measurable in comfort, if not in exact degrees. He had no instruments then, no mercury thermometer mounted on a wall, only his skin, his breath, the frost patterns forming on interior planks. He realized something simple. Cold air behaved like water. It flowed, it pooled, it followed the path of least resistance. And his door, set squarely against the wind, was the widest opening in the entire structure. When Thomas relocated south after the drought ruined his first claim, he chose land more carefully. He studied slopes and tree lines before building. His current cabin sat with its rear wall partially shielded by rising ground, but the front door still faced the open approach from the road. At first, he considered moving the door entirely to the side, but the cabin had already been built. The frame was set. Relocating the entrance would weaken structural joints and cost more time than he could spare. So he began observing instead. Throughout late spring and summer of 1887, while others focused on crops and repairs, Thomas paid attention to wind direction. He hung strips of cloth from a post near his door. He watched how often they snapped straight toward the cabin versus drifting sideways. He noted which months brought stronger northerly gusts. He stood outside during storms, feeling how air wrapped around corners. The pattern was consistent. Most severe winter winds came from a narrow arc across the open prairie. They traveled unobstructed and struck his door almost square. If wind could not blow straight at the door, its force would weaken. If cold air could be trapped before entering the cabin proper, heat would not flee so quickly. He did not think of it as innovation. He thought of it as interruption. Interrupt the path, break the line, force the air to slow. The idea of a simple overhang occurred to him first, a small roof extension over the doorway. But overhangs stopped falling snow, not horizontal wind. The gusts here were not gentle. They carried force. He considered building a fence barrier several feet from the door, yet wind would curl around it and strike anyway. Then he remembered something from childhood. As a boy, he had visited a stone house owned by a distant relative back east. That house had two doors at the entrance. One opened into a small enclosed space, and another led from that space into the home. He remembered being confused as a child, asking why there were two fronts. The relative had laughed and called it a winter entry. When the outer door opened, the inner remained closed. Cold air entered the small chamber, but did not rush into the main house. He had forgotten that memory until he felt another winter gust slam against his prairie door. Two doors, two barriers, but space was limited. His cabin interior was modest. Adding a framed chamber inside would crowd the room and require additional lumber he did not wish to spare. So he looked outward instead of inward. If he could not build a chamber inside, he could build one outside. And if he built it below ground, the earth itself would provide insulation. That thought stayed with him for weeks. Earth did not freeze deeply until later in winter. Beneath the surface, temperatures remained more stable than the air above. He had noticed this while digging post holes in previous seasons. Even when frost coated the ground, a few feet below remained relatively mild. If he carved a passage into the soil, roofed it, and allowed air to settle there before reaching the inner door, the worst of the wind would lose its direct force. Cold air would enter the tunnel, yes, but instead of blasting straight into his living space, it would pool low in the passage. He began testing smaller versions of the concept. During autumn breezes, he stacked two barrels near the door, creating a narrow, angled approach. When he opened the door behind them, the draft felt weaker. Not gone, but disrupted. He placed a temporary canvas screen several feet in front of the door and observed how wind hit it first before sliding sideways. Again, less direct impact. Neighbors assumed he was rearranging storage. He did not correct them. The idea of digging came later, after a heavy rain softened the ground in early September. He stepped outside and noticed how water flowed across the yard. It did not run randomly. It followed shallow depressions, curving when forced. Wind would behave similarly if given shape. The trench would not be straight and narrow like a rifle barrel. It would bend slightly, not enough to inconvenience passage, but enough to deny a clear path for gusts. He paced the distance from road to door repeatedly. He measured with footsteps, counted strides. He calculated width, enough for carrying wood without scraping shoulders, but not so wide that interior air would churn freely. He imagined the tunnel filled with winter darkness, cold resting inside it like a held breath. Then he imagined opening the inner door and feeling only a muted shift instead of a violent rush. That was the moment he knew. Not hope, not theory, confidence. When he began digging, he carried all those observations with him. Neighbors saw only a man breaking ground in front of his own house. They did not see years of small measurements taken without instruments. They did not see nights spent awake listening to one patterns. They did not feel the memory of frost forming along interior boards. They assumed he feared snow on his boots. He feared inefficiency. Firewood represented labor, hours swinging an axe, hauling logs, stacking cords. To burn extra wood simply because wind had a straight path to his door felt wasteful. If he could reduce heat loss at the entrance even modestly, the savings across an entire winter would be significant. He did rough arithmetic in his head. On average, he opened his door perhaps 20 times a day in winter, gathering wood, stepping outside, checking lines, discarding ash. If each opening allowed a substantial rush of warm air to escape, that loss compounded daily. Reduce the velocity of incoming wind. Create a chamber where cold air could settle. Install a second inner door to seal the living space. The logic held. One afternoon, while deepening the trench, he paused to observe how the air behaved within it. Even without a roof, the depression already felt different. Wind skimmed across the top more than it plunged downward. Loose dirt at the bottom did not swirl as aggressively as he expected. He crouched and held his hand near the trench floor. The air felt still compared to knee height. Cold sinks. Heat rises. If cold entered the tunnel, much of it would remain low unless stirred violently. The slight curve he planned would prevent that stirring. He widened one end slightly, creating a gentle angle rather than a straight corridor. It required more labor. He accepted that. The ridicule grew louder as his design became clearer. You will have snowdrift halfway down that thing. Water'll pool and freeze. You'll break your neck. He considered those possibilities seriously. Drainage mattered. So he graded the trench floor with a subtle slope outward toward the entrance, ensuring meltwater would flow away from the cabin rather than inward. He tamped the soil firm underfoot. He selected roof beams thick enough to support heavy snow loads. The sod covering would add weight but also insulation. When questioned, he gave minimal explanation. He had learned that ideas explained too early invite opposition before they can prove themselves. Instead, he focused on execution. While digging, he replayed in his mind the worst night from his northern claim. A blizzard had struck with such force that his door bowed inward under wind pressure. Snow forced through seams and collected in fine lines along the floor. He had fed the fire constantly, yet the cabin never truly felt warm. The heat seemed to fight an invisible current that would not relent. He remembered thinking then, I am not heating a room, I am heating the wind. He refused to repeat that mistake. The trench became a structure. The structure became a barrier. The barrier became a statement. It was not defiance toward neighbors. It was defiance toward wasted effort. As autumn waned, he installed the inner door carefully, thicker than before, tighter fit. He sealed its frame thoroughly. The tunnel would function as a cold trap, a place where outside air could gather without immediately displacing interior warmth. He tested airflow again using smoke from a small torch. Standing at the outer entrance on a breezy day, he watched how the smoke drifted inward, but slowed along the curved section. It did not shoot straight to the cabin threshold. He stepped inside and cracked the inner door slightly. The draft felt muted, not eliminated, but softened. He allowed himself a single, quiet nod. The neighbors still saw folly. They saw extra work before winter. They saw risk. Thomas saw leverage. He did not need to defeat winter entirely. He only needed to tilt the balance. And as frost began forming along fence rails, and the sky took on that pale, metallic tone that signaled deeper cold ahead, he felt something unfamiliar to him during previous years. Not anxiety, preparation. The tunnel stood ready. Not as spectacle. Not as stubborn eccentricity, but as the physical expression of a simple idea he had carried silently for years. If you cannot stop the wind, you change its path. By mid-October, the trench was no longer a curiosity scratched into the earth. It had edges. It had intention. It had shape. Thomas rose before first light each morning when frost silvered the prairie grass, and the sky held that thin blue stillness that comes just before dawn. The air at that hour carried a warning. Winter was not yet fully present, but it was close enough to be felt in the lungs. He lit the lantern inside his cabin, drank coffee gone lukewarm from the night before, and stepped out with his tools. The trench waited in front of him like an unfinished sentence. It was deep enough now that when he stood at the bottom, the horizon disappeared. The earth walls rose on either side, compact and firm, cut cleanly by careful shovel work. He had trimmed the sides straight where possible, but he had also learned to follow the soil, as natural lines. Where roots ran thick, he curved around them. Where the ground felt softer, he packed it tight again with the flat of his shovel. Building downward demanded a different patience than building upward. Logs stacked into a wall showed progress quickly. A trench offered little visible reward. From the road, it looked like absence, like something missing rather than something made. That only encouraged the laughter. You'll strike China if you keep at it. One man called out as he passed with a mule team. Thomas smiled faintly but did not answer. He had begun selecting timber days earlier. Not every trunk would do. He needed straight pieces, free of deep cracks, thick enough to bear weight but not so heavy he could not maneuver them alone. Near the creek, cottonwoods grew in uneven clusters. Their wood was not the hardest, but it was workable and available. He felled what he needed with measured swings, cutting sections slightly longer than the trench width to allow a firm rest on both sides. Dragging the first beam up from the creek bed cost him more effort than the digging had. The ground between was uneven, and he refused to waste a neighbor, as time asking for help. Pride did not drive that choice. Calculation did. The fewer who involved themselves in the work, the fewer who would attempt to alter it. He rolled the beam on small cut branches, inching it forward. By the time he reached the trench edge, sweat had dampened the back of his shirt despite the chill. He paused, studying the span. The beam needed to sit securely on solid ground, not loose soil. So he carved shallow ledges into both sides of the trench, measuring carefully so the beam would rest level. A crooked roof would invite problems later: uneven snow load, water pooling, structural strain. When the beam finally settled into place across the trench, it changed everything. For weeks, the trench had been a negative space. Now it had a beginning of a ceiling, a boundary. Thomas stepped back and examined the line. He added another beam several feet down, then another. The spacing mattered. Too wide, and the planks above might bow under heavy snow. Too close, and he would waste timber. He chose a compromise that felt right to his eye and experience. From above, the trench now resembled the ribcage of some great animal embedded in the earth. Children came closer that afternoon. One boy lay flat at the edge and peered down between the beams. "It is like a fort," he said. Another dropped a pebble. It struck wood and bounced into the trench bottom. Thomas climbed out and looked at them. "Careful," he said evenly. "I'll loosen the soil." They scattered, half embarrassed, half thrilled. By evening, 5 beams stretched across the length from road to near the cabin door. Only the final few feet remained open, where he intended to build the inner threshold differently. He ran his hand along the top of one beam. Rough bark still clung to parts of it. He considered stripping it entirely but decided against the extra labor. The assawed layer above would shield it from direct weather. Simplicity had its own strength. The next phase required planking. He had saved several flat boards from earlier construction, leftovers from when he first framed the cabin. They were not uniform, but they would serve. He supplemented them with freshly cut slabs split from wider logs. He began at the cabin end and worked outward, laying planks perpendicular across the beams. Each board he positioned carefully, checking for gaps wide enough to admit falling debris or wind-driven snow. Nails were precious. He did not waste them. 2 at each end of a plank, driven deep. The sound of hammer on metal rang sharp across the open land. That sound drew attention more than the digging had. Now it looked less like eccentricity and more like a project. A group of men approached mid-morning, boots crunching over frost. "You were sealing it," one observed. "Yes. And what then? You crawl in and out like a groundhog." "I'll walk," Thomas replied, as he had before. They stepped closer, peering at the growing roof. "You planning to live down there?" "No." "Then why bury the path?" Thomas set his hammer down and met their eyes one by one. "Wind runs straight from the prairie to that door," he said calmly. "Not anymore." A pause followed. They shifted, glancing toward the open land beyond the road as if seeing it differently for a moment. "That so?" one muttered. Thomas picked up the hammer again. Conversation ended. By late afternoon, the entire trench was roofed with planks. Only the outer entrance remained open, a dark rectangular mouth cut into the earth. He stepped back several paces and studied the structure. It looked crude from a distance, a low wooden strip laid across disturbed soil. Not elegant, not decorative, functional. But wood alone would not suffice. Left exposed, the planks would weather quickly. Snow would settle directly on them, melt slightly in sunlight, seep between cracks, freeze again. He needed insulation. The answer lay under his boots. Sod. He cut thick rectangles of grass and soil from behind the cabin where the land rose gently. Each piece he lifted with care, preserving roots intact. The weight surprised him at first, heavier than it appeared. He carried the first slab up and laid it atop the planks, grass side down, soil up. Then another, fitting edges tight like mismatched bricks. By midday the roof transformed. The raw wood disappeared beneath dark earth. He tamped loose soil between seams to reduce airflow. When finished, the structure resembled a low earthen ridge rather than a built thing. Grass roots intertwined across the top. Within weeks, if left undisturbed, it might blend entirely with the surrounding ground. Neighbors watching from a distance grew quieter. One woman, carrying laundry, paused and shaded her eyes. "Looks like he's planting his walkway," she said to another. Thomas overheard but did not respond. He focused on sealing the sides where wood met soil. He packed additional earth along edges, pressing it firm with the back of his shovel. He knew wind would search for cracks relentlessly. The more solid the exterior, the less turbulence inside. The interior of the tunnel changed immediately once the roof and sod were in place. Where light had previously poured in freely from above, now only the 2 openings provided illumination, the outer entrance and the inner threshold near the cabin. He stepped inside, lantern in hand. The air felt different. Still, cool, yes, but stable. He stood motionless for a full minute, listening. Outside, a light breeze stirred the prairie grass. He could hear it faintly at the tunnel entrance, a soft rush. But within the passage itself, the sound dulled quickly, swallowed by earth. He crouched and held his palm near the floor. Even in daylight warmth, the lower air felt cooler than the air at chest height. A subtle layering. Cold sinks. Exactly as he had expected. He walked the length slowly, noting where the roof dipped slightly, or where a seam between planks might allow fine snow to sift through. He made mental adjustments. The curve in the tunnel became clearer now that it was enclosed. It was not dramatic, only a slight angle about a third of the way in. But standing at the outer entrance, he could no longer see the inner cabin door directly. The line of sight was broken. That mattered. Wind, like sight, preferred straight paths. The inner door installation required precision. He framed a narrow vertical support at the tunnel's end, flush against the cabin wall, creating a small enclosed space between that frame and the main cabin entrance. It was not a full chamber, but it provided separation. He fitted a solid door within that frame, thicker than the original, reinforced with cross braces. He sealed its edges tightly with strips of cloth and pitch. Now, to reach the cabin interior, one would step from open prairie into the tunnel, walk its covered length, open the inner door, and then enter the living space. 2 barriers. 2 pauses for air to settle. When he tested it on a breezy afternoon, the difference was tangible. He opened the outer entrance first. Wind pushed in, swirling dust near the threshold. But as it traveled inward, the curve and enclosed walls dampened its force. He opened the inner door briefly. The draft that brushed his boots was present, but softened. Less violent. Less immediate. He closed it and waited. The air inside the cabin steadied more quickly than he remembered from previous winters. It was not proof yet. True winter had not arrived. But it was promise. The laughter shifted tone. What had begun as open ridicule now carried uncertainty. You really think that I'll hold under heavy snow? It'll cave in. I'll trap yourself in there. Thomas considered those concerns seriously. He did not dismiss them outright. He reinforced 2 central beams with vertical posts carved into the trench sides, adding support where he felt load might concentrate. He carved shallow drainage channels along the tunnel floor, guiding any meltwater outward toward the entrance. He lined the lowest portion with compacted gravel collected from the creek bed, improving footing and reducing mud. Each addition made the structure more deliberate. One evening, as the sun sank red behind distant low clouds, casting long shadows across the settlement, old Mr. Kessler returned. He walked slowly around the earthen ridge, tapping it lightly with his cane. Solid, he muttered. Thomas stood nearby, wiping soil from his hands. You ever seen one before? Kessler asked. Something like it, Thomas replied. Up north? Yes. The old man nodded once. Wind is a straight thinker, he said quietly. Doesn't like being told to bend. Thomas allowed himself the faintest smile. That's the idea. Kessler looked toward the open prairie. They'll stop laughing if it works. Thomas shrugged. It does need to impress them. Kessler grunted softly and walked away. By early November, frost coated the sod roof most mornings, turning it pale silver before sunlight melted the edges. The grass roots held firm, binding the soil into a single insulated layer. From a distance, the tunnel nearly vanished into the landscape. Only the dark mouth at the road gave it away. Children dared each other to run through it. Thomas allowed it once, under supervision, ensuring they did not damage the packed walls. Their footsteps echoed softly in the enclosed space, a hollow rhythm that felt foreign on open prairie. The sound alone hinted at something different, something sheltered. As days shortened and wind grew sharper, Thomas felt a quiet readiness settle into him. He had not built the tunnel quickly. He had built it carefully, every beam placed with thought, every plank secured against future strain. Every sod slab laid as insulation rather than decoration. Neighbors still spoke of it, some dismissive, some curious, but the edge of mockery had dulled. Now when they looked at the structure, they did not see merely a hole in the ground. They saw effort, they saw intention, and though none would yet admit it openly, they wondered, because building upward into wind was familiar, building downward against it was not. And as the first real snow clouds began to gather thick along the horizon, Thomas stood at the tunnel entrance one evening and looked down its dim interior. It no longer resembled a trench. It resembled a threshold, a boundary between open prairie and controlled space, between exposure and interruption. He stepped inside, walked its length slowly, and closed the inner door behind him. The sound of the wind outside faded into a distant murmur, and for the first time in many seasons, he felt that winter would have to work harder this year to reach him. January did not arrive gently. It came in the night with a hard metallic edge, the kind that makes timber snap without warning and turns breath into visible clouds even indoors. The sky that morning was the color of old iron, low and heavy, pressing down on the prairie as if trying to flatten it. Thomas had been expecting something like this, The air the day before had gone strangely still. No birds moved. Even the horses in their small enclosures shifted restlessly, stamping at frozen ground. The silence had not been peaceful, it had been waiting. By mid-afternoon, the horizon to the north blurred into a gray wall. He stepped outside his cabin and felt it before he saw it clearly. A temperature drop so sudden it seemed to steal the air from his lungs. The wind followed seconds later. It did not build gradually. It struck. Snow, fine and dry as sifted flour, blasted across the open land in sheets. Within minutes, the road disappeared under shifting white. Fence posts became ghostly shapes. The settlement shrank into outlines and shadows. Thomas stood at the tunnel entrance, watching how the first gusts moved. They raced low and hard across the prairie, hit the raised sod roof, and broke upward. Snow accumulated quickly along the windward side, beginning to drift against the structure. He stepped inside and closed the outer entrance firmly. The tunnel dimmed to a soft gray. The air within it cooled rapidly as outside cold pushed inward, but the curve in the passage altered the force. Instead of a straight rush, the wind coiled and dispersed. He opened the inner door briefly to step into the cabin. The draft that brushed his boots was sharp, but not violent. He closed the door and secured the latch. Inside, the cabin held the warmth from the morning's fire. The iron stove in the corner radiated steady heat. A kettle hissed softly atop it. He moved toward the small window and watched snow thicken into a blinding curtain. By dusk, visibility was nearly gone. The storm did not howl immediately. It roared. Wind tore across the settlement with a sustained force that made walls tremble and chimneys moan. The prairie became a single moving body of white, snow lifting and swirling in constant motion. From inside his cabin, Thomas listened. In previous winters, this sound would have carried directly to the door, a pounding, rattling vibration that seemed to shake the entire entrance. The latch would jump in its catch. Fine lines of powder would sift inward under the threshold. Now the noise sounded different. Muffled. The outer entrance of the tunnel took the first blow. Wind slammed into it, pushing snow inward. But as it traveled through the passage, it lost coherence. The curve disrupted the direct channel. The packed earth walls absorbed vibration. The inner door quivered once, lightly, then steadied. Thomas crouched near the entrance and placed his hand against the lower planks. Cold seeped through, yes, but there was no sharp whistle, no thin blade of air slicing along the floor. He sat back on his heels and waited. Outside, the storm intensified. Snow climbed rapidly against cabins. Doors vanished under drifts that rose chest-high within hours. Men in neighboring homes fed their stoves constantly, afraid to let flames dip too low. Smoke from chimneys bent sideways and disappeared into the storm. The temperature dropped further after midnight. Inside Thomas's cabin, the fire burned lower than usual, deliberately so. He wanted to observe. He placed his hand near the floorboards at the entrance. Cold air pooled there, faint but present. It felt like a low tide rather than a crashing wave. He stood and walked across the cabin. The air remained consistent, not shifting in violent currents as it had in prior winters. He allowed the stove to burn at a moderate level rather than stuffing it full. An hour passed, then another. In past years, during storms of this magnitude, he would have needed to feed the fire aggressively, compensating for heat lost through the door each time wind forced itself against the frame. Tonight, the fire held steady with less fuel. He rose and stepped into the tunnel with a lantern. The outer entrance was nearly blocked by drifted snow. Wind forced powder through small seams, and the floor of the tunnel had gathered a thin layer near the mouth. But only the first few feet showed heavy accumulation. Further inside, snow lay scattered and light, as if it had lost strength before reaching deeper. The cold air inside the tunnel felt intense at ankle height. His boots seemed wrapped in ice, but at waist height, the air was comparatively calmer. He held the lantern low and watched the flame. Near the entrance, it flickered wildly, bending toward the cabin as gusts pushed inward. 3 steps deeper, the flame steadied. At the curve, it barely moved. He closed the outer entrance again and returned inside. The difference was no longer theoretical. It was measurable in sensation. Outside, the storm raged without pause for hours. Around dawn, the wind shifted slightly west, driving snow against the sides of cabins that had previously been spared. Drifts piled unevenly, some reaching halfway up walls. Neighbors struggled. One man forced his door open inward against a drift, only to have snow spill across his floor in a white cascade. He shouted into the wind, pulling his coat tighter, and shoved snow aside with his boots. Each time a door opened, interior warmth fled into the blizzard. Thomas heard distant banging through the storm, wood against wood. Muffled voices carried faintly when wind slackened momentarily. He tended his fire calmly. He measured wood consumed since nightfall. It was less than during previous severe storms he had endured. The cabin temperature remained steady enough that frost did not creep inward along the walls. He opened the inner door briefly mid-morning to test the draft again. The tunnel beyond was filled with pale, reflected light from snow outside. The cold air pulled inside it heavily now, trapped and dense, but it remained largely confined to the passage. The inner door frame held firm. He stepped into the tunnel once more, pushing against resistance as snow pressed at the outer entrance. When he cracked it open, a wall of white greeted him. Snow had drifted high across the opening, but not solidly packed. The S-odd roof had prevented collapse. The beams held. He cleared the entrance with slow, deliberate movements, carving a path just wide enough to allow air exchange without allowing the entire drift to pour inward. The wind struck his face like needles. He retreated quickly, closing the entrance behind him. Inside the tunnel again, the air calmed within seconds. That alone would have justified the effort. By afternoon, the settlement looked buried. Chimneys protruded like dark posts from white mounds. Windows glowed faintly from within, small squares of amber against the storm. Thomas opened his small thermometer, a modest instrument he had acquired years earlier. It hung near the stove. He noted the reading. Then he recalled approximate temperatures from similar storms in prior years. Nights when frost had crept across the interior floorboards near the door. He walked again to the entrance and crouched low. The floorboards felt cool but not frozen. He thought of neighbors whose entryways likely held ridges of snow pushed inside by necessity. The storm did not end quickly. It lasted into the second night. Wind continued its assault, relentless and steady. Thomas slept in short intervals, rising periodically to check the stove and listen. He expected at any moment to hear structural strain from the tunnel roof. A crack, a groan under heavy snow load. But none came. The sod roof, thick with drifted snow, had become insulated further. Snow itself acted as a barrier, reducing heat transfer through the roof planks. He realized then something subtle but important. The very storm that threatened collapse also improved insulation. Snow atop the S-sod created a blanket, sealing gaps and trapping still air. By the third morning, the wind weakened. The storm retreated not with drama, but with exhaustion. Snow continued to fall lightly, but the violent horizontal blasts ceased. A strange quiet settled over the settlement. Thomas opened the outer entrance carefully. Bright sunlight struck the snowfield, blinding and pure. Drifts rose shoulder-high along some cabin fronts. The road had vanished entirely beneath smooth white contours. He stepped fully outside and surveyed the damage. Several neighbors were already digging frantically, carting tunnels of their own from doorways to open air. Snow had sealed many entrances overnight. One man's door was completely blocked. He had been forced to climb out a window to begin clearing. Thomas looked back at his own cabin. The tunnel entrance was partially drifted but intact. The S-sod roof stood firm, its contour now softened by snow. He walked the length from road to door without stepping into open wind until the last moment. Inside his cabin, the air felt steady. He glanced again at the thermometer. The interior had held at a level notably higher than he would have expected given the storm severity. Later that afternoon, two neighbors trudged through knee-deep snow toward his cabin. They knocked, boots thudding against the tunnel floor. Thomas opened the inner door. They stepped inside, stamping snow from their boots. Both paused almost immediately. One removed his hat slowly. "It is warm," he said, almost accusingly. Thomas shrugged lightly. "Fire's been steady. How much wood you burned?" "Less than usual." They exchanged a look. Outside, other cabins vented thick smoke for overworked stoves. Inside Thomas's home, the air felt balanced, not overheated, not desperate. One neighbor crouched near the entrance and pressed his hand to the floor. "No draft," he muttered. "Some," Thomas corrected gently. "Not much." They stood in silence for a moment, absorbing it. Outside, men were still shoveling snow from doorways, muttering about frozen hinges and lost heat. Inside, Thomas's cabin felt as though winter had knocked and been made to wait. He did not boast. He did not offer explanation unless asked, but word traveled quickly through a settlement, still shaking off a storm that had tested every structure within it. By evening, several neighbors returned again, this time with a crude thermometer in hand. They measured air near the door. They compared it to their own cabins. The difference surprised them. Not slight, significant. As twilight fell on a landscape reshaped by snow, the laughter that had once followed the digging of a trench no longer echoed. In its place was something quieter, consideration. Winter had delivered its first serious challenge, and the tunnel had not collapsed. It had not flooded. It had not trapped him. It had done precisely what he intended. It had broken the wind, and in doing so it had changed the balance between fire and cold in ways no one in the settlement could ignore any more. The morning after the storm broke, the settlement moved slowly, as if unsure whether the silence was real. For 3 days and nights, wind had ruled everything. It had filled ears, rattled nerves, and reduced conversation to shouted fragments. Now there was nothing but a vast, white stillness stretching to the horizon. Snow lay deep and sculpted into smooth ridges where drifts had formed. Fence posts were reduced to dark stubs poking through the surface. Chimneys rose like lonely pillars from rounded mounds that had once been sharp-edged cabins. Thomas stepped out through his tunnel just after sunrise. The outer entrance required clearing again, but it was manageable. Snow had drifted across the opening in a curved bank, not a solid wall. He carved a path through it with deliberate strokes, pushing the excess aside and widening the mouth enough for airflow. When he straightened and looked across the settlement, he saw movement everywhere. Men were digging downward from second-story windows. Others had cut holes through drifts where doors once stood. One cabin, its front entrance, was entirely invisible beneath a mountain of compacted snow. Each opening meant a rush of cold inside. Each rush meant more wood burned. Thomas turned and walked back through the tunnel, closing the outer entrance behind him. The inner door opened easily. Inside, the air held steady warmth. He fed the stove a single split log and watched it catch. There was no urgency in his movements. He waited, and it did not take long. By mid-morning, boots crunched against the tunnel floor. A knock sounded at the inner door, firm, measured. Thomas opened it to find two neighbors standing shoulder to shoulder, breath fogging in the dim light of the passage. Samuel Reed was the first to speak. "Mind if we come in?" Thomas stepped aside. They entered, stamping snow from their boots, and closed the inner door behind them. Both men paused instinctively. The contrast was immediate. Their own cabins still struggled against lingering cold from the storm's aftermath. Despite burning through large portions of their woodpiles, the interior air in many homes remained stubbornly chilled, floors cold enough to stiffen toes through boots. Inside Thomas's cabin, warmth felt stable, not sweltering, not desperate, balanced. Reed removed his gloves slowly, fees different. Thomas shrugged lightly. Storm passed. That ain't what I mean. The second man, Caleb Turner, moved toward the entrance area and crouched low, pressing his palm against the floorboards. He frowned. "Not frozen," he muttered. Thomas poured coffee into 3 tin cups and handed them around. Reed took a slow sip, eyes drifting toward the inner door. "You opened that much during the storm? As needed? Did T blow snow in?" "Some," Thomas admitted. "Stayed in the tunnel?" They exchanged a look. Word had already begun circulating across the settlement that something about Thomas's cabin had held differently, but seeing it with their own eyes forced acknowledgement. Turner stood and walked toward the small thermometer hanging near the stove. "What is that reading?" Thomas glanced at it. "Just above 50. Turner's eyebrows lifted. "In my place," he said quietly. "It dropped below 30 during the worst of it, even with the stove fed full." Reed nodded grimly. "Same here. Door kept rattling like it wanted to come off." Thomas did not respond immediately. He understood the significance of what they were saying. 50 degrees might not sound like comfort in milder climates, but during a blizzard that drove outside temperatures far below zero, maintaining interior air at that level with moderate fuel was remarkable. Turner stepped back, toward the entrance and motioned toward the tunnel. "Mind if I look?" Thomas opened the inner door and allowed them into the passage. They walked its length slowly, boots thudding softly against the compacted gravel floor. Cold air still pooled low near the outer end, but the intensity had faded since the storm's peak. Reed ran his hand along the packed earth wall. "Solid," he murmured. At the curve, Turner stopped and turned toward the inner door. "Wind, can't he see it straight?" he said, almost to himself. Thomas nodded once. They reached the outer entrance and pushed it open slightly. Bright light flooded the tunnel. Snow glistened outside in blinding sheets. "Drifted, sure," Reed observed, "but did T cave?" "No," Thomas said calmly. They stood there for a long moment, absorbing it. Back inside the cabin, Reed removed his hat fully and rubbed a hand across his brow. "How much would you burned?" he asked again, more carefully this time. Thomas considered before answering. "Less than last winter. Less than the one before." Turner exhaled slowly. "We burned near double what we planned for 3 days straight." "And still cold," Reed added. Thomas stirred the coals gently with a poker. "The wind as the thief?" he said quietly. They looked at him. "Not the snow," he continued. "Not the temperature alone. It as the wind. Takes heat straight out when it has a path." Reed leaned back against the wall, arms folded. "And you broke the path." Thomas did not smile. Bent it. Silence settled. By afternoon, more neighbors arrived. Some came openly curious, others attempted casual conversation before steering toward the subject. A few entered the tunnel cautiously, as if expecting some hidden flaw to reveal itself. Each reacted similarly. They felt the difference before they could explain it. A crude comparison was made later that day. 3 men brought a thermometer from another cabin and placed it near Thomas' entrance while someone else measured the temperature inside Reed's home at roughly the same time. The reading startled them. Thomas' cabin interior measured nearly 22 degrees warmer than Reed's during the storm's peak. The number traveled faster than any rumor. 22 degrees, someone repeated aloud, as if testing the shape of it. It was not a small margin. In practical terms, it meant the difference between water freezing solid inside and remaining liquid. It meant the difference between frost forming along interior boards and walls staying dry. It meant less wood burned, less ash hauled, less strain on already taxed supplies. More importantly, it meant margin. Margin in winter was life. Thomas listened as the number circulated through the group gathered near his stove. He felt no triumph, only confirmation. He had expected improvement, perhaps not quantified so clearly, but sensed through experience. Now it had shape. 22 degrees. Reed looked at him steadily. Why did you say more when you were digging? Thomas considered. You were laughing, he said simply. A few men shifted uncomfortably. Turner gave a short, humorless chuckle. We were. Thomas met their eyes without bitterness. Did he need agreement? Needed it built? The admission carried weight. In frontier settlements, pride often kept men from admitting misjudgment, but survival had a way of thinning pride. That evening, as twilight settled and long blue shadows stretched across snowfields, 2 cabins began digging. Not as deeply, not as carefully yet, but the shovels moved with purpose. Within days, 6 men had marked out trenches from road to door. They asked questions now, practical ones. How wide? How deep? Angle the curve how much? Thomas answered plainly, offering measurements based on his own build. Wide enough to carry wood comfortably, deep enough to block wind at chest height. Bend it so you can see straight through. They listened. He showed them the drainage slope he had carved, explaining the importance of guiding meltwater outward. He demonstrated how to seat beams securely into carved ledges rather than resting them loosely atop soil. He spoke little, but each word carried the authority of proof. The memory of laughter faded quickly under the pressure of shared necessity. Within a week, the settlement's appearance began changing subtly. Low earthen ridges emerged before several cabins. Children played atop them as they had once mocked the first. No one called it living like a badger. They called it practical. One evening, Reed returned alone. He stood near the stove, hat in hand. You know, he said slowly, when you first started digging, I figured you'd lost sense. Thomas stirred the fire lightly. Maybe I did, he replied. Reed shook his head. No, you were thinking further ahead than the rest of us. He hesitated. My youngest took ill last winter during a cold snap. Fever worsened when the house dropped near freezing overnight. We barely kept her warm enough. Thomas listened quietly. If I'd had something like this then. Reed trailed off. The unspoken thought hung heavy in the room. Winter tested more than woodpiles. It tested bodies, lungs, children. Reed looked toward the tunnel entrance again. 22 degrees, he said softly. That's not small. No, Thomas agreed. Outside, another weak front moved through, bringing lighter snow and moderate wind. Thomas watched from his window as Reed approached his own cabin, shovel over shoulder. He did not call out. He did not need to. The storm had spoken loudly enough. As weeks passed, more tunnels appeared. Not identical, some shallow, some poorly curved at first. But the idea spread, adjusted, and refined with each attempt. The settlement grew quieter during storms. Doors rattled less violently. Wood piles lasted longer. No one spoke any more of foolishness. They spoke of airflow, of wind direction, of bending paths rather than bracing against them blindly. Thomas' tunnel remained the first. It remained the deepest. And though he never sought recognition, it became a reference point. When new settlers arrived the following season and asked about the low ridges leading to cabin doors, someone would gesture toward Thomas's place and say, he started it. Saved us near 22 degrees in a storm. The number lingered long after the storm itself faded from memory. 22 degrees was no longer just a measurement. It was proof that small shifts in thinking, a trench in frozen ground, a curve in a path, could change the balance between struggle and steadiness. Inside his cabin, Thomas fed the stove calmly one evening as snow drifted gently outside. He listened to the muted hush of wind traveling over sod and earth rather than striking wood directly. The tunnel did not eliminate winter. It did not banish cold entirely, but it transformed chaos into interruption. And sometimes on the frontier, Interruption was enough. He glanced once more at the thermometer. The needle held steady. 22 degrees warmer than it might have been. Not because of luck, not because winter softened, but because he had chosen to break a straight line and force the wind to bend. And in that bend, he had found margin. Margin for warmth, margin for rest, margin for survival. By the following autumn, the settlement no longer looked the same from the road. Where once there had been a row of simple cabin doors facing open prairie, now low earthen ridges interrupted the straight lines. Some were narrow and shallow, others broad and carefully roofed, but nearly half the homes had adopted some version of the covered entry. It had not happened all at once. The first winter after the great blizzard ended with quiet acknowledgement. No ceremony, no public declaration. Just men digging when the frost left the ground in spring, marking out measurements with boots and fence posts. By summer, timber was being set aside not only for wood piles, but for beams. By early fall, the sound of shovels striking earth echoed across the settlement in more than 1 yard. Thomas never announced himself as the origin of the idea, but people knew. They came to ask him about depth, about curvature, about drainage, about how tightly to seat beams into trench walls. He answered with the same steady calm he had shown while digging alone. "Break the line," he would say. "Don, let wine see straight through." Some nodded without fully understanding. Others grasped the principle immediately and adjusted it to their own cabins. Caleb Turner built his slightly wider to allow easier passage while carrying larger wood bundles. Samuel Reed added a small shelf within his tunnel wall to hold a lantern during night crossings. Old Mr. Kessler, though slower now, supervised his sons as they dug a shorter but carefully angled version for his home. The laughter that had once followed Thomas as efforts did not return. Instead, there was a subtle shift in tone whenever his name arose. Not admiration exactly. Respect. By the time the next January approached, the settlement felt different, not only in appearance, but in confidence. Wood piles were still stacked high, windows still stuffed with cloth, but the doorways no longer faced the prairie naked and direct. When the first hard freeze settled again over the land, Thomas walked the road at dusk, hands tucked into his coat, observing the quiet transformation. The low ridges before cabins were dusted with early snow. Children ran along their tops, pretending they were fort walls. Women brushed frost from tunnel entrances rather than hacking drifts away from door frames. He paused before Reed's cabin. Reed stood outside, adjusting the sod roof on his newly built tunnel, patting loose earth into place. "You made it deeper than mine," Thomas observed. Reed grinned faintly. "Did T want to half do it?" Thomas nodded approval. "Curved enough?" Reed asked. Thomas stepped to the entrance and peered inside. The passage bent slightly before reaching the door. "It'll do," he said. Reed exhaled. One be caught unprepared again. That phrase lingered. Not unprepared. The previous winter had not been catastrophic by frontier standards. No cannons had collapsed. No lives had been lost directly to that storm. But there had been fear, cold creeping too close, wood piles shrinking faster than expected, children coughing in frigid air. The tunnels represented more than structural change. They represented learning. When the next major storm arrived late that season, it was watched with sharper eyes. The sky darkened, wind rose. Snow began its familiar sideways assault. But this time, the settlement did not feel as exposed. Inside cabins, outer entrances absorbed the first impact. Wind pushed into tunnels and lost coherence along earthen walls. Cold pooled low before meeting inner doors. The rattling that had once dominated every storm was muted. Chimneys still smoked heavily, but stoves were not forced to roar constantly in desperate compensation. Thomas remained inside his own cabin during that storm, listening as he had before. The difference now was not only within his walls, but across the settlement. There was less shouting outside. Fewer frantic attempts to shovel inward opening doors free from packed drifts. After the storm passed, men emerged through tunnel mouths carved into snowbanks rather than bursting directly into white walls. Reed crossed the road that morning and knocked at Thomas's inner door. When Thomas opened it, Reed's grin was unmistakable. "Held," he said simply. Thomas nodded. "Same here." Reed stepped inside briefly, stamping snow from his boots. "My place stayed near 45 all night. Did T burn near what I did last year?" Thomas glanced at his thermometer. 48, he said. Reed chuckled softly. "Close enough." Outside, Turner waved from his own entrance, raising a shovel in quiet triumph. The number 22 degrees resurfaced in conversation again, not as rumor, but as a reference point. Reed stayed 20 degrees warmer than before. Turner says he used half the wood. Even Kessler's old place felt steadier. The settlement had not eliminated winter, but it had shifted its terms. By the third winter, after Thomas first dug his trench, nearly every cabin bore some form of covered entry. Some designs evolved beyond his original concept. A few added small interior benches within tunnels. Others extended their passages slightly underground at an angle, incorporating lessons learned over 2 seasons. Children growing up in the settlement began to assume tunnels were simply how doors were built. New families arriving from distant territories sometimes questioned the strange earth ridges leading to entrances. "What s with the buried doors?" one newcomer asked. Reed answered easily, jerking a thumb toward Thomas' cabin. "Ask him. Saved us more than 20 degrees in a blizzard." Thomas disliked the attention but tolerated it. He would walk the newcomer to his tunnel, explain airflow in simple terms, demonstrate how cold settles and wind weakens when forced to bend. Some listened skeptically at first, until winter arrived. The transformation extended beyond architecture. There was a subtle change in how neighbors regarded unconventional ideas. When Turner experimented with stacking hay bales along the north wall of his barn as insulation, fewer mocked him. When another settler proposed digging shallow trenches beneath his cabin floor to moderate ground temperature, the response was curiosity rather than ridicule. Thomas noticed this shift quietly. Frontier communities often relied on tradition. What had worked before was trusted. What differed was suspect. But survival had proven that adaptation mattered more than pride. One evening in late autumn, Thomas sat outside his cabin watching the sunset burn red across the prairie. Reed joined him, settling onto an upturned bucket. "You ever think about leaving?" Reed asked after a long silence. Thomas considered the horizon. "Used to," he said. "Why do you stay?" Thomas glanced toward the row of cabins, their earthen entries blending into the land. "Because this place listens now," he replied. Reed smiled faintly. "Listens to what?" "To winter." The statement lingered between them. That was the real change. They had stopped fighting winter blindly and started studying it. The tunnels were not monuments to one man as stubbornness. They were reminders that understanding an enemy often required stepping aside rather than standing rigidly in front of it. Years later, when Thomas's hair had begun to gray at the temples, he walked through the settlement during another heavy storm. Snow lashed sideways. Wind roared across the prairie. But cabin after cabin stood firm, their tunnel entrances swallowing the worst of the gusts. He paused before his own home, brushing snow from the sod roof, and felt no sense of conquest, only balance. Inside, warmth held steady. Outside, winter continued its endless cycle. The tunnels did not defeat the cold. They negotiated with it. And the settlement endured not because it was strongest, but because it had learned to bend. One afternoon, long after the original laughter had faded into memory, a young boy asked Thomas, "Why did they call you a badger?" Thomas chuckled softly. "Because I dug," he said. "Was it worth it?" Thomas looked down the line of cabins, each with its earthen ridge, each prepared for wind. He thought of the first winter, the rattling doors, the frantic burning of wood. He thought of the number that had traveled from house to house like a quiet revelation. 22 degrees. Margin. He nodded once. "Yes," he said simply. And as another storm cloud gathered low on the northern horizon, the settlement did not brace in fear. It prepared with quiet confidence, because once a man had dug alone while others laughed. And winter had answered louder than any of them.